I think it's the experience of what driving can feel like. You know, the way that the driver is, is defined is about a man who moves. You know, I mean, the drive character is about a man who's in transformation. You know, he's half man, half machine. He's a human being. He's a hero. He's a man of two worlds, and he crosses over from one to the other in the course of the film.
That's Danish filmmaker Nicolas Winding Refn talking about Drive. It's one of my absolute favorite movies. It's unapologetically self-indulgent, featuring bursts of pastel-shaded ultraviolence, driven by a slow burning plot, beautifully calculated framing, and a really terrific cast. Now, Refn is not one to spoon-feed his audience a message, but it's pretty clear to me that each one of his films has a lot to dig into underneath the dazzling surface.
I make genre movies, but I make genre movies which are about existentialistic characters, because all the characters that I make movies about have some kind of deeper internal search, whether it's Bronson of AtLa Rising or the Pusher trilogy, that always leads them to some kind of violent climax.
In interviews, he's mentioned how his movies are often about masculinity, and from that perspective, I'd like to share my own interpretation of Drive. It's a perfect example of how notions of traditional masculinity influence the lives of men. To me, it seems like this film features a bunch of men who are violent killing machines, and it's because they've been emotionally stunted by a larger power structure based on masculine violence. The driver tries to free himself and his loved ones from this system of violence by taking on the role of the benevolent patriarch. He distances himself emotionally and then acts out violently in an attempt to protect his love interest and her family. His expressions of violence lead to further isolation, as well as the perpetuation of the system of violence which he and the other men in the film are trapped in.
Because essentially I'm a fetish filmmaker. I make films based on what I would like to see, not always understanding why I want to see it. I'll leave that to other people to analyze.
And so, as a person myself, and a huge fan of his work, I'd like to share my interpretation of a movie that's almost a decade old. Spoilers ahead, this is what Drive says about masculinity. Okay, first things first, let's define patriarchy, because I'm going to be using that word a lot. It's a loaded word, and it's especially offensive to internet edgelords because they don't understand what it means. First and foremost, you guys,
it's not your fault.
Patriarchy doesn't mean that all men are all-powerful, or that women never objectify men, or that men are the only ones who perpetuate sexism, or that all men are oppressors and all women are victims. That's just not true. Patriarchy is a constructed set of expectations placed on men and women, and it often leads to men's sense of alienation because they feel powerless in a system that tells them they're all powerful. Think of patriarchy as an arbitrary set of social expectations. They're the roles that are easiest to assume with the least amount of pushback. I'm going to make a lot of references to this book throughout the video. It's by Bell Hooks, and she has a lot of interesting takes on masculinity, arguing that patriarchy keeps men from knowing themselves, from being in touch with their feelings, from loving. The way patriarchy achieves this self-alienation of men is through isolation, emotional detachment, and violence. I'd argue that these aspects of patriarchal masculinity are present in all of the men in Drive, but particularly in the driver himself. He's often framed alone, or far away from other people, as well as from the woman he loves. This isolation enables the driver to turn his back to his connection to other people, and therefore his connection to his emotions. Hooks argues that patriarchal masculinity insists that real men must prove their manhood by idealizing aloneness and disconnection. The driver is embodying the male stereotype of the stoic individual. He works alone, and he tries to act like he has no concern for others.
Tell me where we start, where we're going afterwards. I'll give you 5 minutes when we get there. Anything happens in that 5 minutes and I'm yours, no matter what. Anything a minute either side of that and you're on your own. I don't sit in while you're running it down. I don't carry a gun. I drive.
We see throughout the film how patriarchy rewards men for being out of touch with their feelings. Not only does the character not have a name in the film, he has very little dialogue, speaking a total of 891 words, or 116 lines throughout the entire film. For perspective, I'm about 700 words into the essay right now. To indoctrinate boys into the rules of patriarchy, we force them to feel pain and to deny their feelings. The driver's range of emotions include brooding, smirking, blind rage, and more brooding. So much brooding. Hooks writes that rage is the easy way back into the realm of feeling. It can serve as the perfect cover, masking feelings of fear and failure. The driver, and really all of the men in the film, have no way to express themselves other than violence. The men in this film are forced to become killing machines due to their circumstances. These men have all been conditioned to believe that violence and endangerment is the only way to make a living, to protect those they care about. While the driver and Standard may be good men on the inside, they wear the mask of the benevolent patriarch in order to operate under their circumstance. A mask that prevents them from ever feeling safe, from being able to love themselves and to truly love those around them. Instead, they can only express their love by asserting their dominance in every situation.
Because I realized what I wanted to make a movie about is that I wanted to make a movie about a man who protects a woman and what he's willing to do for her.
Ah yes, to save the helpless girl, the classic action hero motivation. While the driver is a good guy, he's heavily influenced by the notion of the benevolent patriarch. He may not overtly subject women to his dominance, but he does have a strong reliance on the maintenance of a hierarchy of power where he is at the top. This struggle to dominate is particularly evident in his first scene with Standard. The conflict stems from both of them wanting to be Irene and Benicio's protective dominator. Both of these men see themselves as the only person capable and worthy of defending the family. Since both of them adhere to notions of patriarchal masculinity, they can't allow themselves to actually voice their insecurities, and instead rely on posturing and competition.
Says you've been coming around helping out a lot? Yeah, helping out? Is that right? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's very nice. That's nice of you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
The women in Drive, like the women in most action movies, are typically furniture, a trophy to reward the hero for successfully dominating everyone around them. There are two women in this film, and they each fit into one of two archetypes often found in mainstream media, expressed through Freud's Madonna and whore complex. Irene is the Madonna, a nurturing, delicate mother figure. She's pure and helpless and relies on the benevolent patriarchs in her life to protect her. The driver idealizes Irene and comes into her life by helping her. His desire for her isn't overtly sexual, instead, he is compelled to protect her because she represents this archetype of purity. Nick Refn has even stated as much about her character.
I had this idea that what if to do a love story in LA, but there was never the complication of love. It's more like the innocence of love and what we'd like love to be. And in order to have that, he would also need to protect it later on so you could justify the extreme violence.
And so as a contrast to this purity he's talking about, there's also Blanche, who's implied to be a sex worker and an untrustworthy criminal, and she's responsible for setting up Standard's murder. The driver feels no need to protect her. Instead, he holds her down on a bed and threatens to kill her. Shortly thereafter, she is brutally killed, punished by the film for her untrustworthy ways. This characterization of women goes hand in hand with the trope of the benevolent patriarch, but I can't help but feel like Refn is doing a lot more than just repeating these action hero tropes. Based on the gaudy yet iconic jacket, stoic individualism, and his job as a stunt driver, it's safe to assume that he's heavily influenced by the archetype of the classic action hero.
Well, absolutely. I mean, he's certainly built on an archetype of a certain hero that you have a lot in America because of the cowboys. We also have it in the samurai movies and so forth, which is the enigmatic man who comes out of nowhere to protect innocence.
These are the types of characters who are ruggedly unemotional, who solve all their problems with guns and fists. Much like these characters, the driver has a dangerous career, and an even more dangerous side hustle.
What do you do?
I drive.
Like a limo driver?
Like for movies?
Oh. You mean all the car chases and stuff?
Yeah.
Isn't that dangerous?
Bell Hooks uses the Incredible Hulk as an example, but her insight applies to just about every depiction of masculinity in mainstream media. She says, "The exertion of physical force, brutal and monstrous, was a viable response to all situations of crisis. The action hero archetype is the symbol of the ultimate patriarchal man, alone on the road, forever drifting, driven by the beast within." In the end of the movie, when he fully embodies his heroic identity, he's wearing a mask that looks almost exactly like Vin Diesel, who plays a dominating action hero in the Fast and the Furious franchise. But it's just that. It's a mask. It's the driver living out his heroic fantasy. Furthermore, on paper, Drive isn't really that different from a Fast and Furious movie, aside from the low budget. In fact, according to Nick Refn, that's how the script started out at Universal Studios, before Refn got his hands on it.
Well, originally Universal had bought the book called Drive, and then they spent X amount of percentage of it developing it into a kind of a $60 million Hugh Jackman, Fast and the Furious kind of spin-off.
Which makes sense, because the bare bones of the story is just about a heist gone wrong, but it's Nicolas Winding Refn's tastes as a director which elevate the film to something so much more. Like the driver's mask, the action movie facade is only the surface, a coat of pastel-colored paint over a deeper, more nuanced interior. Refn chooses a much more contemplative tone instead of quick cuts, bloated action scenes, and a soundtrack by Pitbull. These qualities in action flicks like Fast and Furious present the benevolent patriarch as admirable, a figure that we should look up to. Drive, on the other hand, prompts us to question them. There's so much restraint, frequent pauses, silence, a lingering attention to moments of solitude. All of these techniques and many more prompt the audience to take a step back and wonder if the driver is actually doing the right thing to think about and to question the role of the benevolent patriarch, instead of allowing us to get lost in a car chase that goes on for way too long. There's only one traditional car chase scene in this movie, which happens halfway through. I say this is the only traditional car chase because it's fast-paced and has the most action. The opening scene is slick and stealthy escape, while the one during the climax is more of a car murder than a chase. The chase after Standard is killed has all the speed and stakes of a film that makes you earn the action. This entire sequence is built up to with nail-biting tension. The ticking clock, a family's freedom is at stake, a budding alliance between the driver and Standard, and the viewer is seated in the car right next to the driver, anxiously waiting for the clock to tick down. And for a split second, it actually looks like it's all going to work out, giving the audience a moment of relief before reality comes crashing down. Every movement, every choice is deliberate, moving the story at a steady pace and giving every scene and character beat room to breathe, room to connect the dots yourself, wonder what could possibly go wrong, what could possibly be going through the driver's head. While he has barely any dialogue, and he may appear on the surface to be playing the role of the stoic individual action hero, the camera and framing are saying so much more about him. Is he really a good guy? What does he want? Is he going to help Standard? Is he a monster? What is his nature, and how far will he go to get what he wants? One of the major themes in this film is human nature, and I would argue specifically the nature of man and masculinity, since those are the only characters in this movie with any agency. The fable of the scorpion and the frog is alluded to throughout the film, and directly referenced at the end.
You know the story about the scorpion and the frog? Your friend Nino didn't make it across the river.
The fable goes as follows. A scorpion and a frog meet on the bank of a stream, and the scorpion asks the frog to carry him across on its back. The frog asks, "How do I know you won't sting me?" And the scorpion says, "Because if I do, I'll die too." The frog is satisfied, and they set out. But in midstream, the scorpion stings the frog. The frog feels the onset of paralysis and starts to sink, knowing they will both drown, but has just enough time to gasp, "Why?" The scorpion replies, "It's in my nature." This fable posits that it's some people's nature to be bad, and that's that. Don't trust a scorpion. While the driver may see himself as the scorpion, he's conflicted on whether that means he's all bad. In the scene where him and Benicio are watching cartoons, he says,
Is he a bad guy?
Yeah,
How can you tell?
because he's a shark.
There's no good sharks?
No? I mean, just look at him.
This exchange works on a few levels. On a meta level, the driver could be literally asking the audience whether or not he should trust Bernie the loan shark, who he met in the previous scene. On a thematic level, he's wondering whether or not he's a good person. He's questioning the patriarchal narrative that it is man's nature to be violent. He's directly asking Benicio, what if I'm a shark? Can I be a good shark? Can I ever be a good person? On top of that, the driver wears an extravagant golden emblem of a scorpion on his back. We can read this in a couple of ways. Either he's the frog, carrying the scorpion on his back across the river. He's the driver, he doesn't use guns, he doesn't do the crimes, he drives, taking the metaphorical scorpions across the river. Or, the role of the scorpion is one he plays, wearing the image like he wears the ball cap to blend in with sports fans in the intro. Or the action hero mask at the climax of the film. I personally prefer the latter interpretation, as I think it works well with the rest of his characterization and symbolism. His day job is roleplay. He is a Hollywood stunt driver who lives out his fantasies of being the action star on his off days. He's playing the role he was taught to play at work and by the patriarchal system he inhabits. Either way, the driver is clearly conflicted about his identity, but he is unable to confront his own emotions due to his adherence to patriarchal masculinity. According to Hooks, patriarchy as a system has denied males full access to their emotional well-being, which is not the same as feeling rewarded, successful, or powerful because of one's capacity to assert control over others. So, while the driver is really good at what he does, and in many ways he can be considered successful, he is so cut off from his emotions that he lacks any sense of happiness. Submitting himself to traditional masculinity makes him feel less than human, which further isolates him and makes him question his own nature. On the topic of music, isolation, and emotions in Drive, Nicolas Winding Refn has the following to say. It's all about being isolated and not knowing why, and using music as a way to express your emotions, like almost a way for you to cry. Being the stoic, unemotional, isolated patriarch, the driver has completely cut himself off of his own emotions. So instead, Refn lets the music communicate the character's emotions to the audience. The movie's music was produced by Cliff Martinez, who frequently collaborates with Refn. His soundtracks are great. I think my favorite collaboration of his and Refn's is Neon Demon, but Drive is a close second. Cliff's work on Drive features a heavy use of synthesizers as well as several electropop songs with female voices. The synths in the music create a dreamy layer over the songs, while maintaining a level of artificial darkness. Kavinsky's Night Call features a male voice, distorted by robotics, giving it a less than human sound. While the songs Under Your Spell by Desire and A Real Hero by College and Electric Youth feature the same synthy, outrun vibes as Night Call. All three of these songs feature varying uses of a childlike female voice. And so if Refn intends to use music as a way of communicating a character's emotions, then I don't think it's a coincidence that these emotions are communicated through a female voice in the songs. The reliance on songs featuring a female voice reinforces the themes of patriarchal masculinity, which associate femininity with a deeper emotional connection, and vice versa for masculinity, no emotion. Now let's take a look at what these songs reveal about the driver's emotions, if that's what they're supposed to mean.
Hey, do you want to see something?
A Real Hero is used during the scene where the driver takes Irina and Benicio back from the mechanic. This scene features non-diegetic sound, meaning sound that clearly is not being produced within the on-scene space, such as a voiceover or added music. If the music, as Refn puts it, is a way to express your emotions, then this scene reveals how the driver feels. After helping Irene with her car and taking her home, the driver remains stoic and completely unemotional in the moment. Yet, the soft sounds and lyrics reveal that he is emotionally complex. Where the driver is expected to be unemotional and stoic, under the surface there's a much deeper desire to be close with Irene and Benicio. And so he expresses this desire in the only way he knows how, by trying to be the benevolent dominator and controller in the lives of Irene and Benicio. He usually sees himself as a bad guy, and so being a good bad guy is the only thing he can do. Asking her out and pursuing her as a romantic equal isn't an option to him, because for him, the only way to connect to people is through protecting or attacking them. This same twisted perspective about emotional connection is later depicted once again through the soundtrack, and this time diegetically. We see the driver is literally isolated in the dark at his work table. From a distance, we can hear the song Under Your Spell coming from another room, rumbling through the walls. Once again, if the music is used to represent emotions, we can hear that the driver is far away from his emotions. His emotions are in another room, but the feelings are so loud that they still resonate to him wherever he is. Though he has feelings, he is actively avoiding them in favor of focusing on his own work in the dark. Bell Hooks perfectly sums up this moment, saying, "It is simply assumed in patriarchal culture that men should be willing to sacrifice meaningful emotional connections to get the job done." All this to say that I don't think the driver or anyone's nature is to be either a scorpion or a frog. People are complex. We don't fit into societal roles that a patriarchal system insists upon us. The driver's conflict with his own nature is a product of a larger system at work, a system which has conditioned him to think that he must be an unemotional killing machine in order to be worthy of human connection. The reality is that patriarchy enforces a toxic sense of masculinity, where man is expected to isolate himself from his emotions, where the only acceptable form of self-expression is violence. The reason I say this movie has a larger message about how patriarchy affects men is because every single man in this film is trying to escape a deadly circumstance. In trying to escape their circumstances, the men in Drive use the only methods they are taught, violence and isolation, which leads to a repetition of the same cycle, more violence and more isolation. We know Shannon tried to escape the loan sharks, and he ended up with a permanent limp.
He got involved with some of Nino's friends. They didn't go for the overcharging bit. They broke his pelvis.
Standard got out of prison and paid his debt, but the people he owed money to didn't allow him to get out so easily, so they killed him. Even Bernie and Nino, the big antagonists of the movie, have an argument about getting out of a larger mob conflict.
I'm gonna tell you something. Anybody finds out you stole from the family, we're both dead.
Bernie specifically is a Hollywood producer who had already escaped a violent past, but is forced by his circumstances to return to his old ways. His past is still chasing him. Every guy in this movie is subjected to a larger power system, keeping them in their place with the threat of violence. Young Benicio learns how the system of toxic masculinity works when he finds his father beaten to a bloody pulp. Violence by men, against men, witnessed by boys. Since violence is all they know, it's the only way they can resist, which only lands them deeper into the clutches of patriarchal masculinity. Yet, men aren't the only ones who contribute to patriarchal masculinity. When the driver finally tells Irene the real situation, she slaps him. She wants the benevolent side of the patriarch and not the frightening reality. He is trying to reach out to her, but even the woman in his life is not comfortable with a patriarchal role model showing his weakness to her. Hooks points out that most folks continue to see men as the problem of patriarchy. This is simply not the case. Women can be as wedded to patriarchal thinking and action as men. Irene is a single mother. Standard was absent while he was in prison, and now he's dead. Hooks argues that female-led households such as Irene's are in fact more likely to idealize the patriarchal male role in patriarchal men than those who already live with a patriarch. I guess someone has to teach Benicio how to be a man, and it's not going to be the driver anymore because he got a little too honest with his emotions. The moment in the elevator during the third act between the driver and Irene is, in my opinion, the whole thesis of this film. It is a microcosm for the self-perpetuating cycle of isolation, violence, emotional detachment, and repeat. After confessing to Irene, standing in an elevator with a mobster out to kill them both, they share a first and final kiss. The driver tries to escape the situation and protect Irene by stomping the guy into a human puddle. The tragedy here is that in his attempt to protect Irene, the driver reveals his violent tendencies to her and effectively isolates himself even further from her life. This is the last time the audience sees Irene and the driver together, and most likely the last time that the driver sees her too. The scene ends up on a close-up of the Scorpion, showing us that the driver has taken on the role of the violent masculine hero. He has become the Scorpion. And so, once all the men in the film are dead, and after Bernie and the driver's final confrontation, where they both try and kill each other with their phallic weapons, it appears the driver is dead. And as the song, A Real Hero, begins to swell, the driver starts the car again. We know he saw himself as a bad guy earlier in the movie, but has any of that changed? Has he learned anything? Has the driver emerged from the shadows? Since his methods of isolation and violence worked, in the sense that Irene and Benicio are safe, I honestly can't say that the driver has learned anything. He will likely continue to isolate himself and act out violently in order to assume the role of the benevolent patriarch. The cycle of lonely, aggressive masculinity is bound to repeat. If we continue to assume that the soundtrack represents the driver's emotions, we can deduce that he believes that the role of the violent, emotionally distant, benevolent patriarch is his nature. It makes him feel like a real human being, a real hero.